Zechariah chapter 2. I almost did the whole chapter tonight. It's a short chapter, but ended up only getting through the first 5 verses because the second half of the chapter kind of deal with the first 3 visions together. So I'll do that next week. But Zechariah chapter 2, verse number 1, he writes, I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. And then said I, Whither goest thou? And he said unto me, To measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof, and what is the length thereof. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him, and said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. For I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Now, keep in mind as we go through these, and I'll come back to this at the end, but the purpose of Zechariah's ministry was not only to give us these wonderful eschatological prophecies, and we'll see that more in just a moment, but also to encourage the people, right? To encourage the people as they are in the midst of this strange transition, just having come out of Babylon and coming back to a ruined nation. And so he and Haggai kind of, teamed up in this prophetic ministry to encourage the people to rebuild. And the first 2 prophecies that we've looked at certainly would have aided in that. But I think this one is very clear in how it would have aided the people as far as encouragement is concerned. And so here we see verse 1. Again, he lifted up his eyes. And I think I mentioned this last week. But I read several people, and I have no reason to disagree, who think that we see this phrase a lot at the beginning of these prophecies, that he'd lift up his eyes, because when one of these visions were ended, it's almost as if he was bowing his head and praying and reflecting and thinking about what he just saw. And so here he had to lift up his eyes again to see, because again, he's not dreaming. Remember that. He's not dreaming. He's actually seeing these things. These are visions, not dreams. That is a separate thing. And so he lifted up his eyes. He begins to see this third now vision, third of 8 that he's going to get in this one single night. And so this time he looks up and he sees this man, and this man is holding what we would call a measuring tape, right? That's just kind of what's going on. And so he sees this guy with this measuring line in his hand, and as always, Zechariah is seeing this, but he's not given the understanding immediately, and so he asks. He goes to this man and he asks, what's going on? As we're going to talk about a couple of different times where there's big debates upon who somebody is. But just like a lot of these visions, there's a lot of debates about who this man is. And just like always, I'm very careful to, not dogmatically say this is who this is, because all we get here is what it says. He saw a man. That's it. That's literally all the information we get. And so some people say, well, this was Michael. Some people say, well, this is just another angel. Some people say this was a pre-incarnate Christ. I think you could honestly make a case for any of them. And so, again, if we were supposed to know, it would have told us. And so, that's just as strong as a statement as I'll make on that. And so he sees this man. This man is measuring out what is Jerusalem. And now back in chapter 1, verse 16, it says, a line shall be stretched forth upon Jerusalem. Well, here's that line, right? This is that taking place. And so, this man is measuring, and Zechariah comes up to him, and I think this will become more clear in just a moment, but I think Zechariah is probably very, very confused at this moment. Confused for a couple of reasons, not only because this is just a strange, a phenomena, and anybody having an actual vision, there'd be a sense of confusion on there, but nevertheless, at this particular time, there isn't really much of a Jerusalem. And so this man is there measuring out Jerusalem, and as we'll talk about in just a moment, measuring a significantly larger portion of the land that Jerusalem, that at least Zechariah thinks Jerusalem should be. And so he's kind of confused. And so it would be several decades after the time of Zechariah before Nehemiah would lead a group out of Babylon, and they would begin to rebuild the walls, and the city would begin to be repopulated in earnest. Now, there's some people there now, but not many. And we'll see later on, it was a struggle to kind of get Jerusalem repopulated. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And so what Zechariah was seeing there, this man, again, that's just what I'll call him because that's what the text called him, this man measuring Jerusalem. He was probably confused, again, because at this point it was probably just the rubble of the former Jerusalem. Again, not many people there. and measuring this very large portion. And so Zechariah rather is just trying to place all this together. And so he says in verse 3, or rather he asks the man, and the man tells him, I'm measuring Jerusalem to see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. And then we have verse 3, that interpreter angel comes back, the same one that we've seen in the first two visions. And so this interpreter angel comes back, and he's talking with Zechariah, and then another angel shows up. And again, all of these people are debated. People, debate who's going on here. But we have this interpreter angel. We have another angel come up. And then verse 4 is really, really important here. It says, and said unto him. Now, it's not exactly clear who's speaking here, but I think the best interpretation of this is the other angel telling the interpreter angel to speak to Zechariah. Okay, that seems to be the what is taking place here. But it says that another angel went out to meet him and said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. Now here, just like again with all these other things, the identity of this young man is debated. Again, some people say it's Christ, some people say it's angel. I think, and I'll tell you why in just a moment, I think it's very clear that this is actually Zechariah, that Zechariah is the young man. I came across a couple of times another interesting interpretation of this. Now, I can't verify this because I just don't know for certain, but I saw in a couple different places that there's apparently a Mormon teaching that the young man in verse 4 is Joseph Smith, and the other angel in verse 3 is Moroni. And if you know anything about Mormon doctrine, Moroni was supposedly this angel who dropped out of the sky and gave Joseph Smith these gigantic golden tablets from which he translated the Book of Mormon and then took those golden tablets with him back up to heaven. And so the Mormon, again, I cannot verify that, but apparently this is Mormon doctrine here that this is actually Joseph Smith. But nevertheless, I do believe that it's very clear that this must be Zechariah. And the reason why I say that is because the angel gives a message to be proclaimed, right? He says, go tell this guy, he says, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. What is this if not the thrust of the ministry of Zechariah? Is to prophesy and encouragement to the people to get them involved in the work of rebuilding the temple. And so this would, verse 4, would be a strong encouragement. And Zechariah is the prophet whom God has chosen to be the proclaimer of that message. And so it just makes sense that the message would go to the messenger who's already been giving the messages, okay? And so it just seems very clear that this must be Zechariah, that he must be the young man here. But the angel's message was this very great, encouraging message. Jerusalem shall be inhabited. Again, imagine, at this point it was not. There was not a whole lot going on for Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem shall be inhabited, and not just inhabited, but inhabited as a town without walls, because there's going to be so many people, so much cattle, all these things going on within the city. And so perhaps, I think this adds to the confusion of Zechariah. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, not only was Jerusalem not really existent at the moment, but it seems very clear from here that the man was measuring a portion so large, like I mentioned earlier, that Zechariah he basically says, I don't know what you're measuring, but it's certainly not Jerusalem. I don't know what you're doing here, but this is too much. And so this is the message that comes in. He says Jerusalem at some point is going to be so populated that it will be as if it has no walls. In other words, people are going to go beyond the walls because there's not going to be enough room for all the people, for all the cattle. And what does that equate? That equates blessings of God, right? That's what that would, Zechariah, that's what the people would equate that with. Right? God's going to bless to such a degree that the walls can't even contain the population of Jerusalem. And so again, this is well in fitting and well in keeping with the message of Zechariah. Now the question for us then becomes, when is this? When does this take place? It's certainly not taking place within the lifetime of Zechariah. And so a lot of people say, well, this takes place when Nehemiah comes along. And Nehemiah comes along and he builds the walls and Jerusalem begins to be repopulated. But from the book of Nehemiah, I think we can see that that clearly can't be the case either. In Nehemiah chapter 11, interestingly enough, we read this. It says, and the rulers of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people also cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9 parts to dwell in other cities. And the people blessed all the men that willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. And so by the time Nehemiah comes along, which again is a few decades after Zechariah, by the time Nehemiah comes along, they rebuild Jerusalem, they rebuild the walls, they're starting to populate the city. The leaders of Israel are living there. But there's a problem. Most of the people, not the leadership, the rest of the people of Israel, they're not living in Jerusalem. And apparently, according to Nehemiah here, they didn't want to. And so they actually start casting lots so that 10% of the people not living in Jerusalem had to actually move and go to and start living in Jerusalem. To the point where it says at the end of verse 2, it says, the people blessed the men who willingly offered, right? Some people said, don't cast lots. We'll just go live in Jerusalem. And people were blessing them. Oh, thank you that you would make this sacrifice and go live. And so apparently at the time of Nehemiah, at the very least, Jerusalem wasn't exactly what we would say overflowing at the borders. And so again, this cannot be at the time of Zechariah, cannot be at the time of Nehemiah. And giving some of the other things that we'll talk about in just a moment, it seems clear to me that this must be a millennial proclamation. This must be a millennial prophecy here. Jeremiah proclaims, and this is also a millennial prophecy. Jeremiah in chapter 30 says, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents, and have mercy on his dwelling places. And the city shall be builded upon her own heap, and the palace shall remain after the manner thereof. And he says, and out of them shall proceed thanksgiving, and the voice of them that make merry, and I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will also glorify them, and they shall not be small. Okay, and so here Jeremiah is prophesying this great influx of population and things and blessings that are going to be taking place during that millennial kingdom. But then verse 5 just adds to that understanding. And so verse 5, it says, for I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. And so there's 2 basic statements made here in verse 5, and again, I think both add to our understanding that this is millennial. And so he says, at this time, instead of physical walls, God promised to be that which would protect them. In other words, you won't need walls. You'll have me. You'll have me there protecting you. He says he would be like a wall of fire. And he's not saying a literal wall of fire. He's saying I'll be like a wall of fire. In other words, like I said, you won't need walls. You will have me. Like I said, I think this further emphasizes this as a future fulfillment. And here's why I say that. Even if at times Jerusalem has been highly populated, and there have been times where it has. In fact, I looked, and right now, Jerusalem is just under 1 million in population. That's a large number. And so there have been times in its history where Jerusalem has been well populated. However, I don't think that you could honestly say there has ever been a time when it has been both well populated and secure from her enemies, right? Because this is what God is promising here. I will be a wall of fire for you. What is that? That's protection. And so again, I don't think that you could ever say there's been a point in Israel's history that you could point to exactly and say this is very clearly a time of great population increase, great blessings, because again, verse 4, it's not just people, it's people and cattle, right? So we're not just talking about overpopulation, we're talking about people and blessings, material blessings, but on top of that, people, blessings, and protection. Right? Again, I don't think you could ever say that that's been taking place. And then the last portion of verse 5 just puts it over the top. And so he says not only would he protect them, but he would be with them physically. He said, I will be there. I will be the glory in the midst of you. I will be there in the middle of you. And so again, all this, I think, really clearly points us to a time still yet future. I'll quote Ralph Smith here. He said, at a time when others such as Nehemiah were interested in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and excluding from the community those who had divorced their wives and married young foreign girls, you see that story in Ezra chapter 10, Zechariah sees a vision of the future Jerusalem as a broad, spreading metropolis with the wall of God's presence around her and the glory of his presence within her. Again, what does this scream, if not the millennial reign of Christ? And so again, I think this clearly points to that time in the future. And so the time that best fits this would be that time when Christ sits on the throne of David in the city of Jerusalem. When Isaiah chapter 2 talks about all the nations will come to her, He will be the crown jewel of the world at that particular time. And he will sit, again, on the throne in Jerusalem, physically reigning. He will protect her. He will be the glory in the midst of her. All of these things fit with what Zechariah is saying right here. It'll very much be like what we read in Isaiah chapter 60. It says in Isaiah 60, it says, "Violence shall no more be heard in thy land, wasting nor destruction within thy borders, but thou shalt call thy walls salvation, and thy gates praise." It says, "The sun shall no more light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee, but the Lord shall be unto thee an everlasting light, and thy God thy glory." And so Isaiah and Zechariah here both kind of communicating the same message. But again, all of this was given to Zechariah for the purposes of proclaiming to the people that which would inspire, that which would encourage, and lead them, not only, and we keep talking about the rebuilding of the temple. That obviously was part of it. But the ultimate goal is not just the rebuilding of the temple. What does the rebuilding of the temple lead to? The ultimate goal was to be in right relationship with God. Right? That was the purpose of it. The rebuilding of the temple leads to that step. But the ultimate goal here was to encourage them to get back into this right state. Again, we saw this in Haggai, and Zechariah is doing the same thing. But again, I think with all the first three, I think we've seen very clearly, a phrase we use a lot, a near and far, an incomplete and a complete fulfillment of these prophecies that he's given. And then we'll see this next week. But in the last half of chapter 2, he kind of expounds on these first three ideas. And then starting in chapter 3, we'll see several more of these visions that he had in this one night. So again, just some really interesting things here in the book of Zechariah, which I do believe, again, have very important implications for us even still today, as we're, again, still waiting on some of these things to take place.